I see a message. It says it's now streaming live.
Awesome. Well, looks like we are live then. So good afternoon to everyone there in Facebook land.
Hello.
Yeah, you're here with Allana McKinnon, who's a fellow FDN practitioner, and she's a boss. She's one of my favorite people, super knowledgeable, and I got the pleasure of meeting Allana last year at the FDN conference in San Diego. We got to be roomies and attend all kinds of seminars together on mold and hormones, and it was a great way to connect with a lot of FDNs who, prior to that, we had all just been mostly communicating with each other just over the private Facebook groups.
Yeah, we got to have lots of late night deep conversations about all things functional health.
Oh, so many conversations. It was an awesome opportunity to just totally geek out, and I think we learned a lot from each other.
Totally.
That's definitely one of my favorite parts about this whole functional community, is really how much you can learn from everyone else who's has specialties. And I will say, I'm not just saying this because you're here, but I definitely have a lot of respect for you, and you're one of the more active people in the FDN world, and I've learned a ton from you since becoming an FDN myself. So
thank you. The respect is mutual. I know you are the same. You're extremely knowledgeable. I know you're very helpful for your clients.
Thank you.
And I know that we're both kind of trying to change the whole conversation around autoimmunity, and you specifically with Hashimoto's and me with celiac, and it's good stuff.
That's right. We're changing the world, one person at a time. And I really feel like there is a sea change and a whole growing movement of people that are becoming interested in their health and working with health coaches, and even some medical professionals that are kind of starting to dip their toes and put one foot into the door into this world. So
yep,
it's going to take time. Change doesn't happen overnight, but we are just one small part in the revolution.
Yes. Happy to be here.
So Allana, if it's all right with you, I'd like to give you a formal introduction for all that's kind of trickling into the meeting. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. There will be a replay available on this page immediately afterwards. So if you're not able to attend, you're at work, what have you, you'll be able to view it all afterwards. So Allana McKinnon, thank you again for being here with us this afternoon. Allana is a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner and a certified and a certified gluten practitioner. She works one-on-one with clients suffering from autoimmunity, celiac, gluten-related disorders, gut dysfunction, stealth infections, hormone imbalances, and detoxification. She helps her clients find out why they feel sick with functional lab testing, and then uses natural protocols, nutrition, lifestyle techniques, and mind-body techniques to find relief and reversal of illness. Allana's clients report they enjoy working with her because she listens intently, is compassionate, understands chronic illness personally, and has a myriad of tools to help them get their life back. It's a very good and bold mission statement. And with that, I want to open up the floor to you and just kind of give us a little bit of your history, how you got into all this, your history of symptoms leading up to your celiac diagnosis, and kind of where you're at today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Like so many of our fellow practitioners, we are led to this profession by our own health issues and our own health struggles. And that was definitely true for me as well. It was really, I've had lifelong health struggles, but I'm going to focus kind of today on celiac and what was happening as I was getting diagnosed and just prior, and kind of the various factors that led me to finding FDN. So initially there was a couple factors that I think were triggering events for me that led to autoimmunity. One was I got a bunch of travel vaccinations. So I was on my way to Central America and wanted to like do the right thing and got some vaccinations, and I did fine with them at the time. And then while I was in Central America, I did get food poisoning. So I got very sick with that. And I took a round of Cipro. My doctor gave me Cipro to take with me just in case. And so I took that. And we're finding now that antibiotics can definitely be a triggering event for celiac specifically, and definitely autoimmunity. So after that, I, for months, like kind of had symptoms here and there, kind of felt okay, but then started having a pretty, big health decline. And around that time, I had a pap smear done, and they actually found precancerous cells. So they had changed from abnormal to actually like precancerous. So it was, definitely very alarming to find that. And my doctor recommended doing a LEAP, which is where they surgically remove part of your cervix. So in the past, I had abnormal PAPs and addressed it with diet and various lifestyle factors and supplements. And by this point, I was so utterly exhausted, had really intense chronic pain, and I was just worn down. So I didn't feel like I had fight in me. So anyways, the LEAP procedure that they did on my cervix, I ended up bleeding for the next week, like pretty profusely. So that landed me in the ER with heart palpitations, and I was just extremely weak, and they were able to get the bleeding to stop after about a week. So that was August, and then I really never recovered. I was extremely exhausted. I was probably anemic from losing all the blood. And, shortly thereafter, I got diagnosed with celiac. And so, of course, in hindsight, it makes sense why I was bleeding profusely. And I actually had visited the doctor several times during that week, and they couldn't get the bleeding to stop. And I was probably vitamin K deficient, because it's very common to not have sufficient fat-soluble vitamins when you have celiac because of all the malabsorption. So all the symptoms leading up to celiac, I was in extreme pain, joint pain, muscle pain, back pain. My neck felt like I had this like vice grip on it all the time, so lots of headaches. I was very weak. Like I remember getting up in the morning and I would have to hold on to the counter in the kitchen because I felt like I was going to fall over. If I sat down for any period of time, my knees would actually swell up, and then I'd go to get up and I'd have to hobble, for the next 50 steps or so until my knees would chill out and I could walk again. I actually lost a lot of weight with celiac, which I know some people gain weight, some people lose weight. So I was already a thin 5'8", 115 pounds or so. And at diagnosis, I dropped down to 100 pounds. And then later, after diagnosis, I actually dropped down to 90. So I looked terrible. I looked like I was maybe undergoing some cancer treatment. Like I was very emaciated and very weak. So finally got diagnosed, went gluten-free, and then over the next 6 months, I just got worse. I lost 10 more pounds. The headaches were relentless. The pain was relentless. And I just felt like I was starving. I think I literally was starving from the malnutrition, even though I was eating like massive quantities of food. I just had this sense that I wasn't getting the nutrition that I needed to heal. So I feel like that's important, because sometimes we expect to go on a gluten-free diet and it'll, you think you'll be better in a week or 2 weeks or maybe a month. And it literally took me 6 months to even see a positive change. And I didn't feel great after 6 months, but I started seeing some positive change. So it took about a year after diagnosis to really feel like I had my energy back and the pain had subsided. I wasn't feeling like I was starving all the time. And it took probably another year for me to gain the weight back. But by then I was actually feeling the best I had felt like ever, which was very exciting for a while. So after that, I had kind of like this little honeymoon period where, after diagnosis, felt well for a while. And then I was actually able to get pregnant very quickly. I had my first child, and the pregnancy was like awesome. I felt great during it. So after first kiddo, things changed for sure. I started, I actually didn't sleep with her for like 6 months. She had her own allergies and stuff going on. So sleep deprivation, the hormonal changes, just being a new mom, I started not feeling great again. So things kind of started slipping after the first kiddo. After second kiddo, I was a mess. So around 2010, I probably had SIBO prior to second kiddo. So if you don't know what SIBO is, it's a small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So it's typically either colonic bacteria coming up into the small intestine, or it can be brought on by food poisoning. So it made my gut hurt really bad. And then during that second pregnancy, I was very anemic through the whole thing, and very short of breath, and like very weak through the whole pregnancy. So it was kind of tough to get around and go upstairs. And then after a second kid, like life was busy with two toddlers, and we started eating more gluten-free packaged food. Our diet started slipping a bit. I did the mom thing of like drinking a glass of wine every night, like it was me time while I made dinner, and I'd have that glass of wine, and I wasn't paying attention to sugar. And so I can definitely see some lifestyle factors that led to symptoms coming back. And I actually went through a period of time where I thought I must be getting gluten because the symptoms were so similar to prior to being diagnosed. So I started scouring spices and ingredient lists and throwing away pots and pans and wooden spoons. And we didn't eat out at the time, so I knew it wasn't coming from there. But so it was rough. So, that kind of led me to FDN because I kept trying to eat vegetables and clear up my diet, and it would make me monumentally worse. Like the gut pain was really bad, and the joint pain was really bad. So I started learning about FDN and functional testing. And I had visited lots of doctors. They didn't really find much of anything besides some hypothyroid. And so I really wanted those functional tests. So through the functional testing, I found out, I had a ton of infections, parasites, had SIBO, heavy metals, lots of toxicity. Mm-hmm. I found, Lyme, Ehrlichia, Babesia, Bartonella, I was just like full of infections essentially, which to me is a sign that my immune system was really struggling with things. So, going through the FDN training, we get to test ourselves. And so I found all sorts of things going on. And then from that testing, I was able to address the infections and the leaky gut and all of the inflammation that was going on in my body through diet, using the autoimmune paleo diet, and then also using, natural herbal antimicrobials, working on my immune system, working on detox, and working on my gut to get my gut into a better place. So I really feel like I owe my happiness and my sanity to FDN. And it was, amazing finding all the things that were going on, and then also being able to resolve all of those symptoms. At one point, I sat down and just wrote down everything that was happening, and I had over 150 symptoms going on. Like I was just a mess from day to day. It would be like, pain in different areas, or numbness, or restless leg syndrome, or it's just everything, allergies, asthma. So FDN was amazing. It definitely helped me a ton. And I also realized that celiac is an autoimmune disease. We know this, but sometimes it gets a little pushed under the rug because we just think don't eat gluten, like end of story. And what I found is there's just so much more to healing, and removing gluten is the first step, but more healing needs to take place after that. So that's why you and I are here.
Thank you for all that. Yeah, you are what I would describe as to my clients that have all these different issues going on all at once, I call that like the full house.
Mhm.
Yeah. But you are
Yeah.
this like living, breathing testament that the body does have this innate intelligence and can be restored
Mhm.
to normal function if we're, willing to put in the work and implement those diet and lifestyle changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now here you are talking to me today and
Mhm.
working with clients, all over the country and helping them to
Mhm.
restore their health as well.
Yep. Yep.
So earlier you had mentioned after the celiac diagnosis
Mhm.
that you were still dealing with this weight loss, being underweight, being
Yeah.
malnourished. So
Mhm.
explain that to us. What's the deal there? Why is it not just as simple as cutting gluten out of the diet and then
Mhm.
everything to be okay?
Yeah, so, if you look back at the factors that cause autoimmunity, all of these pieces come into place to begin the autoimmune process. So, looking back at all of those factors, there was so much that went into becoming celiac, and so I see it as there's a lot that needs to happen to heal from celiac. So we know that, with celiac, your body begins attacking the villi and the microvilli in your intestines. So those are the little hair-like projections in your small intestine, and their job is to absorb your nutrients. So when those little hair-like projections are, we call them blunted because they start to kind of lay down on the intestinal wall, those start to go away, and then your intestines have these like nice hills and valleys in them that increase the surface area, and all of that surface area allows us to absorb our nutrition. So those hills and valleys start to flatten out, the villi are gone. So pretty soon you're really not absorbing much of your nutrition. So you become very malnourished. Not uncommon to find anemia, vitamin D deficiency, B12 deficiency, you name it. You can be deficient in it when you have celiac. So in addition to that, we also know that you have a very leaky gut. So, one piece of celiac that we see is the presence of gluten can elevate a hormone called zonulin.
Mhm.
And zonulin's job in the gut is to open up the little junctions between our epithelium. So there's like a thin little single cell wall on the small intestine. And when you eat your food and your body's broken it down, zonulin's job is to open up those cells to allow the nutrition into your bloodstream and then close them. And in the presence of gluten, zonulin can be elevated all the time, and those little junctions open up. So pretty soon you have, not only gluten passing into your bloodstream, but bacterial toxins, environmental toxins, yeasts, all sorts of stuff that's going to be triggering an inflammatory response. So to heal, we really need to heal the gut.
And that mucosal barrier is extremely thin and delicate, right? It's only
Exactly.
one cell thick. Right? So it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have gluten exposure to trigger that zonulin production and create that intestinal permeability,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yep.
the key word there is with selective permeability, with
Mm-hmm.
to refer back to that process that you were mentioning, whereby zonulin can selectively create that space in between the cells to allow nutrients to pass through, to allow
Yeah.
toxins to be flushed out and handled by the immune system.
Mm-hmm.
We want that to happen to some degree, but not on a chronic 24-hour, 7-day a week basis.
Exactly. Exactly.
I often will make this analogy as well as the villi being like shag carpeting, or even like a lawn, like blades of grass in a lawn. And gluten, if you have celiac, it essentially comes along and it just mows all your villi down, and
Yeah.
you don't have those villi then to absorb your nutrition, right? So
Yeah. It's a great analogy. Mm-hmm.
even when we are eating like the perfect, grass-fed, wild-caught, organic diet, and getting everything from the farmer's market, I mean, that doesn't even mean much if we're not absorbing those nutrients.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So I know that it might depend on the individual. And for you, you mentioned it took about a year. So would you say that's probably the average recovery time? And also for our listeners out there, is it possible for those villi to restore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's such a great question. So recovery time is very individual. Like we see kids bounce back pretty quickly. When you get diagnosed with celiac, part of the diagnosis is usually an endoscopy where they put a tube down your throat and take biopsies just to look at the villi and, look and see what's happening with your gut. So with kids, we typically see that come back pretty quickly. Kids are pretty resilient. Only about 30% of kids will have continued symptoms and problems. Adults, however, we have found the research shows that about 50% continue to struggle and our guts don't heal. So that's, in a medical setting, only removing gluten. That's kind of what happens. So 50% of the time, the villi is coming back, it's regrowing, your body's healing. And then another 50% of the time, it's not. So it can be tricky.
And is it for those 50% that have that impaired recovery, is there anything that can be done from a holistic perspective to start or accelerate that?
Yeah, so, all the things we do. So in addition to gluten, there can be other food sensitivities. So very, very common is dairy. About 50% of celiacs, again, will have problems with dairy. And it's not just a lactose issue, it's more like a protein issue. Other food sensitivities can be present, which, when you're eating foods that are inflammatory to you, which may not be inflammatory to your neighbor, it's going to cause damage to your intestines and it's going to cause a continued immune activation. So your body's going to be inflamed. It's going to be hard to heal. We're also finding that there are many pathogens that can put you on the route to autoimmunity. So different viruses, different bacteria, mold even can, Lyme co-infections can all trigger an autoimmune disease. So I find, to take a holistic approach, I'm always asking what factors caused autoimmunity in the first place? Do you have high levels of heavy metals? Do you have a lot of stress in your life? Lots of medications can cause damage to the gut, the microbiome. So we're always asking all those questions, like what happened? And how'd you get here? And then it's almost like we work our way backwards and address all of the pieces to allow you to heal. And you can heal, most people can heal. But most of us, if you're those 50% of adults that are still having symptoms, don't feel well, it's time to make sure you're not getting gluten cross-contamination, which is extremely common. And then B, start to take some proactive measures with anti-inflammatory diet, nutrient-dense diet, taking care of stress in your life, making sure you're sleeping, making sure you're getting outside in the sunshine, addressing any infections you might have, finding out if you're living in mold. All those things can be a blocking factor that will, disallow the gut to heal.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, what it sounds like is any kind of infection or toxic burden is going to drive inflammation, and that inflammatory process itself can tilt us towards autoimmunity, create that kind of celiac flare, right? So in order to fully resolve the issue, it's not just a matter of not eating gluten anymore and being strict about gluten. We also have to work upstream, do a little digging and find out, are we living with SIBO or H. pylori or Candida or general dysbiosis, things that are, driving this ongoing inflammatory process. So that's something I think that needs to be, explained more to the general public, is that any, inflammation and autoimmunity are co-activators. So you
Yes.
get trapped in this vicious cycle until you do something to break that cycle. And from our perspective, the only intelligent way to do that without guessing is to get some data in front of you, right?
Exactly.
And that was the only way that you were able to identify all the sources of stress, metabolic stress in your body.
Yeah, and I think, another important piece here too is I kept going to my doctor and I wanted answers. I wanted to know, why didn't I feel good and what was going on? And, I wanted to know why. And I think that's a question that really frustrates, some doctors. Some doctors are fabulous. Some doctors totally will go the extra mile with you. But, I wasn't finding those doctors. And, they might run a couple tests and just be like, you're fine.
That's right.
Like they didn't have anything for me. So that was definitely very frustrating. And I knew there had to be more. I knew there was more to the story. I knew that there was more to healing. And so it's definitely going through the FDN program really opened my eyes to, all of the factors that will contribute to illness, and then all of the things that we can do to get better.
Very well put. Earlier, you had mentioned along your healing journey that you had developed SIBO. Is there a connection between gluten exposure, celiac, and SIBO, and what is that connection? Do you feel like that was a predisposing factor to you developing small intestinal bacterial overgrowth later on?
Yeah. SIBO is really common in celiacs. I'm not sure if they know why. But what I find in my practice is there are a couple factors. One is other infections. So when you have celiac, it's also not uncommon to become IgA deficient. So immunoglobulin A. It's a mucus lining that covers all of our mucous membranes, our sinuses, our mouth all the way down to anus, vagina for women. So this mucus is kind of our first line of immune defense as we are ingesting pathogens, which we do. We ingest things. So it's really common with celiac to not have enough of that piece of your immune system. So you do become more susceptible to infections like parasites. And then with SIBO, the other piece, so SIBO is often caused by something, it can be parasites, any insult to the microbiome. So it can be antibiotics, it can be non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. It can also be drugs like SSRIs for depression. So we are just starting to study the different medications that can disrupt our gut and our microbiome. And I think we're going to be blown away at all of the drugs that do that. So it can be so many different factors, but one big piece with SIBO and celiac is glyphosate and the way we spray Roundup on our wheat. So when wheat is harvested, not always, but sometimes they douse it in Roundup and it makes it go to seed and then they get a bigger harvest. So when we eat that Roundup, we're eating a ton of glyphosate. And glyphosate is it's a very toxic chemical. It's water soluble and it acts like an antibiotic on steroids. So it will selectively kill off our good bacteria that we need for balance and for nutrients. And, our gut bacteria help us digest, they help us make energy. They have a ton of jobs. So when you're killing off the good bacteria and then glyphosate actually selectively leaves pathogenic bacteria, you are setting yourself up for a microbiome dysbiosis where, the balance of the beneficial bacteria to the bad bacteria becomes off. So it's, I think SIBO has so many factors. There's also abdominal adhesions, which are also very common with celiac. It's like these little micro tears that happen throughout the small intestine that can create scar tissue, and then that will disrupt your migrating motor complex, which is kind of this wave-like motion your intestines go through to move the food along. So, many kind of factors with celiac make us predisposed to gut infections in general, and then also SIBO.
Sounds like the general theme there is that gut health is extremely important for overall health.
Yes.
So for someone who might be new to this and just kind of tuning in, that doesn't really maybe have a lot of background or knowledge about the microbiome, play devil's advocate, what's the big deal? Like, so if you have some beneficial bacteria being compromised and the gram negative, the bad guys, the bad bacteria are taking over, what are the consequences of that and why should we care?
Yeah, so we're actually kind of like in the middle of an explosion of microbiome research. So it's fascinating. And basically every week I'm seeing new research come out that shows that the microbiome affects another body part, essentially. So everything from our weight balance, our metabolism, our inflammatory state or lack thereof, our mood, anxiety, depression. What else? Pretty much every system of our body is affected by our microbiome. So changes can literally make you all of a sudden become obese or become thin. Can make you have brain fog. It can make you have trouble concentrating and pulling words. It can make you extremely anxious. It can make you have, toxicity issues, hormonal changes. A lot of our neurotransmitters and our hormones are actually made in the gut. So I don't know of any area of life that is not affected by our microbiome. And then our microbiome, the gut bacteria actually tell our immune system what to do. So when you think about that, if you're having immune challenges, either autoimmunity or maybe you're getting a lot of colds and flus and maybe don't get over them, or something's up with your immunity, it's your gut. It's your gut microbiome that actually tells your immune system what to do.
And just to speak in more general terms, it's believed that we have up to 10 times more individual bacteria in our entire body than we have number of cells, right? So in many respects, it's very easy to argue that we're more microbe than we are human.
Yeah.
I've heard that we have more bacteria in our body than there are stars in the universe. So if that helps put it in perspective, it's almost incomprehensible.
Yeah, it's wild. And there are instances too, like there's certain infections, like an example is toxoplasmosis. So there's certain infections that their job to survive is they will actually change your thinking. So this is a total tangent, but toxoplasmosis, it's typically a rodent to cat parasite. So when a mouse gets toxoplasmosis, the parasite actually changes the mouse's brain, and the mouse becomes kind of sexually attracted to the cat. So it no longer has this fear of the cat. The mouse will go to the cat will eat the mouse, and that parasite then gets to complete its life cycle in the cat. So humans can get infected as well with toxoplasmosis, and oftentimes it just passes. But what we're finding is that when humans get infected with toxoplasmosis, we can become obsessive compulsive. We tend to take more risks, tend to be like a business owner or someone who has just kind of a more risky life. Sometimes we can see addiction come out of it. So it actually is changing your thinking, changing who you are. It's kind of wild.
Hijacking your brain.
Hijacking your brain, yeah. You
Crazy.
see the same with, candida, like a yeast overgrowth. So if you have a yeast overgrowth and you're trying to quit sugar, and sometimes there's just no amount of motivation that can make you not eat that cookie.
It's not
Because
you
the
that's,
yeast,
it's not
yeah,
you.
the yeast are literally telling your brain, eat it.
Yeah, right. Well, then which is almost encouraging in a sense for
Mhm.
someone who were to realize that, say, to run a gut pathogens panel and to see that, because
Yeah,
it's not just a matter of willpower, right?
exactly.
Oftentimes your metabolism is being hijacked by these pathogens, and
Mhm.
you lose that ability to restrain yourself from carb.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 I remember when I was getting some of my lab tests back, it was like Christmas because all of a sudden I had a reason why I felt so crappy.
Oh, yeah.
Like finding parasites, I was so excited to find parasites because my gut was a mess. And, I was like, finally, I know why.
You're like, yes, my gut is a mess, right?
Yes, yes, it was very validating.
Yeah.
Yeah, in an odd way.
I often tell people, because I think this is remarkable, in initially reading Isabella Wentz's book on Hashimoto's thyroiditis, she
Yeah.
mentioned repeatedly the connection between developing autoimmunity to the thyroid and specifically two infections in the gut, one being H. pylori, which,
Hmm.
which is a bacterial infection that resides in the stomach lining, and then a parasite called Blastocystis hominis, which is a parasite that
Hmm.
large intestine. And I when I ran my first round of gut testing, I had both of those, and I was super excited, and it was so validating to have just read
Hmm.
and find this kind of key or answer to what I was looking for. And after having addressed those issues, just feeling like I never had before. And don't get me wrong, I still had additional work to do. This is
Right.
like everyone tuning in has learned from you. You went through, quite a journey, and there's always, layers to. It's not as though we just reach a point when we're done and
Mhm.
I'm unhealthy for the rest of my life.
Yeah. And I am not perfect
Yeah.
either. I have flares, I have things that I can trigger myself with. And yeah, it is always a process.
You're probably, 80% better than you were
Oh,
maybe.
yeah. Like I'm fully functioning now, which is amazing. Yeah. I had those same infections too. I think that's how we actually became friends.
I
We
think
were
so.
both finding all the same infections.
We're like probably helping each other out with like how do
Yeah.
what's the right protocol and diet for this, and
Yep.
right set of herbs to eradicate the infections. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's just definitely one of the cool things about being a functional practitioner is all the nuggets and gems of information we learn from each other.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Another infection with Hashimoto's is Epstein-Barr. So some people actually believe that when your immune system is attacking your thyroid and you're seeing those thyroid antibodies, when you test them, that your immune system is functioning perfectly well, doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's not going haywire, but
Mm,
it's actually going after this virus. Epstein-Barr loves our thyroid. So it does beg the question of, just the role of infections in autoimmunity. And I think as the years go by, we're going to actually realize that
mm.
they have a big piece. And then the bigger question is, how can we support our bodies and our systems and our immune system to be in balance with all these critters? Because you're never going to be critter free, and our immune system's job is to keep viruses in check. And, if a parasite is causing problems, to get rid of it. And ideally we live in harmony with these various infections, even Lyme. A lot of people have Lyme and they don't have symptoms, so the question is why. And I think it's that our immune system needs the training that it gets from infections, yet we need to have a healthy, diverse microbiome. We need to not be stressing ourselves out all the time. We need a good diet, we need sleep, we need sunshine. It's like we need all of those basic pieces to be in healthy coexistence with the critters.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and that there's so much more that we still have to learn about the mechanics
Hmm.
of all this. But it reminds me of, I believe it, Dr. Klinghardt espouses this belief that it's not so much the bug that's the problem, it's the immune reaction.
Hmm.
Like you said, we need to live in this harmonious balance, but yet we can become symptomatic when we're immunocompromised, or if our immune system is overreacting to a
Exactly.
pathogen instead of just chilling out and kind of letting it coexist.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the symptoms that we experience are actually our immune system, kind
Mhm.
of in that hyper chronic inflammatory state. That's what we're feeling when we feel sick and when we're having symptoms. We're actually feeling our immune system.
Well, since we're on the topic of the thyroid,
Hmm.
this might be helpful to some folks. What's the connection between gluten, celiac, and Hashimoto's for those out
Hmm.
there with autoimmune thyroid issues?
Yeah, so there's a lot. So, we do know that once you've developed one autoimmune disease, you are 25%, likely to gain another. And again, that's one of those stories that can be changed and reversed with a little bit of work. So, having one autoimmune disease predisposes you to another. Again, it's kind of all of those factors that led you to have one autoimmune disease are going to lead you to have another if you don't intervene. So, the interesting thing with Hashimoto's and celiac and gluten is that the gluten proteins, as they get slightly broken down by our digestion, but we actually lack the ability to fully digest gluten. And we're seeing this kind of becoming more of a problem with the glyphosate, the Roundup, and then also the way that we have hybridized wheat. So our wheat today has more gluten proteins, it has different gluten proteins. It's something our body was never exposed to in the past. And then, we also tend to eat a lot more of it now these days. So gluten-related disorders are kind of, becoming an epidemic. They're definitely on the rise. They're definitely a problem for a lot of people right now. So as your body's breaking down those gluten proteins and not able to break them down completely, and then gluten is telling zonulin to open up your gut for 4 hours. Does this in everyone. So it opens up those little tight junctions. You've got these large gluten proteins traveling into your bloodstream. And then your immune system sees those gluten proteins and they shouldn't be there. So your immune system is going to tag them with an antibody and basically tagging them as a foreign agent that needs to be removed. So as your immune system is tagging that gluten over and over and over again, the gluten looks a lot like your thyroid tissue. So they call it molecular mimicry. We can have our immune system see gluten and then see our thyroid tissue and start attacking thyroid tissue, thinking it's gluten.
Right. So the thyroid gets caught in the crossfire, like friend,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. The immune system can't tell the difference between an amino acid sequence in a gluten protein versus your own thyroid tissue. So,
Exactly.
like you
And
alluded,
many other tissues too can get attacked. So each autoimmune disease kind of has its place where your immune system is attacking, and it can be almost anywhere. Interestingly, with gluten, it can begin that process.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned two things that I thought were interesting. One, that the human body, the digestive system, can't fully break down gluten, and that in anyone who consumes gluten, zonulin is triggered for 4 hours. So this is kind of like the big question that I think we have at this stage of understanding, and it begs the question: is everybody sensitive to some degree to gluten?
Yeah, so such a good question. The short answer is yes and no.
Right.
So
Complicated.
it is complicated. Yeah. So for a lot of people, you eat gluten your intestines become leaky for 4 hours, they heal back up. And like, you never know, you never notice anything. You don't have any symptoms. I think, the big problem that's happening today is that we eat a muffin for breakfast, and then we might eat like a breaded chicken sandwich for lunch, and then we have a pasta dinner. And that means your gut just became leaky for the entire day. And then you do that the next day and the next day. And so your body might be able to continually heal for a while until one day it doesn't, and then you start experiencing symptoms and problems. So, for reality's sake, yes, I think some people can handle gluten. If you have any symptoms whatsoever, and I'm talking anything like constipation, fatigue, insomnia, high blood pressure, a lot of people kind of get used to their symptoms and we think they're normal because everyone has them, and they're really not normal. So recognizing if you have symptoms at all, I think personally that gluten needs to be investigated.
Sure.
And certainly if you have an autoimmune disease or any sort of chronic inflammatory state going on, gluten is likely contributing and causing problems.
Sure. So basically, in a nutshell, anyone with chronic ongoing symptoms should basically get screened for celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
Yep.
And that would lead us to ask the next question here, which would be, how do we distinguish between the two? What's the difference between celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity?
Yeah, so testing, if you've ever been in the land of celiac testing, you may have found that it's fraught with difficulty. So, getting your doctor to test you for celiac can be challenging. Sometimes you need to beg and plead or find new doctors, oddly. I think everyone should be screened, but sometimes it's really hard to get them to agree to test you, especially if you don't have the kind of like the picture perfect symptoms of GI distress, wasting, fatigue, and if you're a kid, failure to thrive. So, a lot of people do not fit that picture. You might just have neurological symptoms and no gut symptoms.
Right.
So, getting your doctor to test you is one piece. And then typically your doctor will run a blood test where you need to be eating gluten. So it's very important if you are suspecting celiac and you have not yet gone gluten-free to get tested first. So before you try the gluten-free diet, go ahead and get a celiac test. And most doctors will run a test through blood that's called anti-transglutaminase. They're looking for a specific enzyme antibody that shows up with celiac. It'll show up elevated. Some doctors look also at anti-endomysial antibody. And then other doctors will look at deamidated gliadin protein. So there's a couple different ways to go about it. Different doctors test different things. And unfortunately, the testing is fraught with difficulty again. So a lot of false negatives occur within celiac testing. So it's not until you have full villus atrophy, where those little hair-like projections are gone or laying down, that the testing becomes accurate. So if you're newly developing celiac and you go get tested, you're probably going to be negative, even though you have an autoimmune process beginning in your body. So it can be very frustrating. Another option is looking at celiac genetics. The genetics are actually very common in the US. So about 40% of the population has celiac genetics. So running genetics cannot diagnose celiac, but it can tell you if you are highly unlikely to develop celiac. It doesn't tell you if you could be gluten sensitive, So if you've done the blood test and they come up high, the next step is to get an endoscopy where they actually put a tube down your throat and take biopsies So they look to see, what does your small intestine look like? And then if that comes back negative and you feel like, man, gluten is, you have that intuition, or you just, every time you eat gluten, you feel disoriented or groggy, or you get gut pain or fatigue, or, any symptoms after gluten, I think it's definitely worth either testing with a test that we can talk about in a minute that's better, or a trial of a gluten-free diet.
Sure. Which will save you money from having to run a test, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Initially, when I went gluten-free, I just did it cold turkey.
Mm-hmm.
I believed in it conceptually, and also everything else I was trying wasn't working. And it took maybe not even a week for me to notice dramatic improvements. The two things that really changed immediately for me were my depression, which almost completely lifted. And also, I was dealing with a lot of acne at the time.
Yeah.
That pretty much went away completely as well.
That's awesome.
And then I never turned back, actually. And it wasn't really until, gosh, just a few months ago that I finally actually ran a wheat sensitivity panel just out of curiosity. And we'll get into that shortly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, and I think real quick, one thing I like to stress to clients as well is, being on a gluten-free diet for life, it's hard.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard. It changes your social life. Sometimes family won't accept it. It brings all sorts of challenges. It makes restaurants challenging. So, if you are in that time of not going gluten-free yet, that's the big reason why I say go test, is because let's say you go gluten-free, you feel better, and then you start wondering, like, do I have celiac? Like, do I have an autoimmune disease? Do I need to pay attention to that? Or if you have children, sometimes kids need a 504 where, you need accommodations at their school. So getting diagnosed, I think, is very important. However, if those tests are coming back negative and, you're suspecting gluten, I just think, at that point you tried to get diagnosed, what, do you have celiac or not? I don't know. But if you do find that, gluten seems to be a problem and you eliminate it and you feel better, there's your answer.
This is where it's helpful to understand that not all tests, well, no test is perfect, right?
Yes.
We don't want to just blindly go by what the test results are telling us. It's so important to correlate that with our symptomology and our symptom history, right?
Definitely.
Certainly
And sometimes you drive your doctor crazy. Like my youngest daughter, she was very ill by 3, and I was suspecting gluten, and she had stopped growing, and she was just emotionally distraught and would tell me all the time, just, Mommy, I don't feel good. Mommy, I don't feel good. So I knew, we got her tested several times for celiac and it was always negative. And I was just like, no more suffering. We're taking gluten out. And literally within 4 days, she was a new person. Like, she was happy. She was smiling. She would, in the past, she would fall down and hurt herself and she would just cry all day, and so now she'd fall down and be like, I'm okay, Mommy. She'd get up, and it was amazing. And she grew so much that year. So I had my answer. The pediatrician was pissed. They were super mad that I had done that.
Well, you have to be your own health advocate. You have to be your own advocate. And so
yeah.
You're a good mom. So how common is gluten sensitivity versus celiac? Give us kind of like a breakdown of like the likelihood of celiac versus the likelihood of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And then I'd talk a little bit about this kind of myth that there's no such thing as gluten sensitivity.
I have to make a little note of your questions because then I forget.
Repeat them.
So I see different, so it actually depends on areas of the world. The rate of celiac is actually different in different areas of the world. So I roughly see Somewhere between 3 and 9% of the world has celiac.
Okay.
So, that in comparison to non-celiac gluten sensitivity, I've seen, and around 30% have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And it is something that, if you go to your doctor, they might poo-poo it and say it's non-existent and might call you a hypochondriac behind your back, or, they might do that. The research is plentiful. Like we know what it is. We can test it, and it's a real thing.
Sure, sure.
So
it's pretty baffling that there's so much gluten bashing in media, and you'll see these clickbait articles like "there's gluten sensitivity is not a real thing. Stop whining." It's just, you'll see a lot of articles written about how it's just a fad and it's trendy.
Or you'll see articles saying that it's dangerous to eliminate gluten from your diet.
Right, sure.
Now, like last I checked, we don't have a daily need dietarily for gluten. We can replace those nutrients in many ways.
Absolutely. And calorie for calorie, wheat is not all that nutrient dense to begin with. So even
lots of problems.
Right. So even if we're not talking about intestinal permeability and villus atrophy, all problems that can occur from consuming gluten, even aside from all that, it's not all that nutritious to begin with, right? So there's more than just one reason to take it out of the diet. So I always like to point my clients to a couple different articles, and I think I'll just go ahead after our chat and share them in the thread underneath the video.
Awesome.
You're familiar with both of these. One was in the journal Nutrients in 2015, and Alessio Fasano was a part of that research team who was basically credited with discovering this three-legged stool model for autoimmunity. And to just kind of summarize what they discovered in that study was that between three groups, those with celiac, those with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and then healthy controls, and it was the same or similar elevation in zonulin, all three groups.
Right.
Which might suggest, and perhaps there needs to be more research done around it, that more or less everyone is sensitive to gluten, and that triggering of zonulin occurs in everybody.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the other big piece with zonulin that's not talked a lot about is when you have elevated zonulin, it actually sets you up for metabolic syndrome. So it sets you up to have a higher weight and obesity. It sets you up to have higher blood pressure, hormonal dysregulations. It changes everything. So zonulin's not just the gatekeeper in our gut, but it actually, we see a correlation between high zonulin and then high instance of metabolic disorders.
That's right. Yeah, there's basically no symptom or condition that can't be traced back to leaky gut in some capacity.
Right.
Once you have all the contents of the lumen, the inner gut leaking into your bloodstream, that's going to cause this inflammatory cascade throughout the body, right? Yes. So don't think that just because your symptoms aren't localized in the gut, that it's not related to your gut somehow, which is tricky. We're taught to think in a very localized way. And, the Western model of medicine, basically doesn't teach us these associations that everything is interconnected. And years ago, I heard Dr. Kalish say, "Everything causes everything." And it's as absurd as that sound. It's so true when you really get all the lab work in front of you and you're able to correlate everything. There's nothing that's not interconnected to every other organ and gland and system in some way.
It is very true. Yeah, and I just want to reiterate a point you just made is any symptom can be related to your gut. So it doesn't have to be gut symptoms. It doesn't have to be, bloating or constipation or diarrhea or gastritis. It can be brain fog, and that's your only symptom, or it can be depression, or it can be joint pain or arthritis. So you can have other areas of your body showing signs and symptoms, and you can have zero gut symptoms. You can also have celiac with zero symptoms altogether, or zero gut symptoms. So it doesn't have to be symptoms of the gut.
I have had clients that have pushed back on me a little bit about wanting gut testing, which in some cases can be pricey, depending on your. And until you see those results, it can be hard to explain that. So, look, like the anxiety you're experiencing, even though you have, quote unquote perfect gut health, and you're not experiencing gas, bloating, or IBS or reflux or anything like that, don't assume that just because you don't have any symptoms in your gut that it's not related to your neurological symptoms, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I'm looking at this other study here too that was done in 2016 at the Columbia University Medical Research Center. And it was very similar to the other study in nutrients, where they were looking at 3 different groups: those with self-reported non-celiac wheat sensitivity, 40 individuals with celiac, and then 40 healthy subjects that were more or less asymptomatic. And they reported very similar results, that the non-celiac wheat sensitivity group also showed an equal increase in intestinal permeability to the celiac group. So in some cases, the non-celiac gluten sensitivity can be worse than celiac.
Yeah.
It's not like one's not less or more serious than the other.
Yeah, I think, the general public and the medical community sees celiac in a certain light. We know it's autoimmune. We know it can predispose us to death, cancers, you name it. It can be a problem. And I've actually heard Dr. Alessio Fasano say that he feels that non-celiac gluten sensitivity can be actually more dangerous. And part of it is the lack of awareness and the lack of acceptance.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have awareness and you don't have acceptance, you're less likely to really strictly go on a gluten-free diet. So you have this chronic inflammation, this fire raging through your body, and you are more likely to have antibodies to different tissues. So it could be your nervous system that's getting attacked. It could be your brain. It could be your myelin sheaths. It can be anywhere in the body. And that's a problem when your body's being attacked. And I know you and I both run the Wheat Zoomer, and you can run the Neural Zoomer with it, where we look at antibodies to the central nervous system and the brain. And it's really common to see autoimmune attack on your brain. And one of the first action steps there, if you're seeing that, is to eliminate gluten. And there are other things, other pieces can be part of that attack, but gluten is step 1.
Gluten is step 1. Yeah, and so let's take us into the realm of testing then. So how do we figure this out? What's the best test? What's the go-to test that your practice to look for all these clues that there's an issue with gluten?
Yeah, so I know you and I use the same test. So there's a lab called Vibrant America, and they make a test called the Wheat Zoomer. And the reality with celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity is that your body can react to any component of wheat and gluten. So part of the problem of celiac testing is that we're often looking at, alpha gliadin. We're looking at one protein within the whole slew of proteins that are in wheat. So you can miss these other autoimmune reactions that are going on. So with the Wheat Zoomer, it looks at almost 50 markers for all of the different components of wheat, the different proteins, different lectins that are in wheat, different
Even
you know,
non-gluten proteins.
non-gluten proteins. Yeah. So, the wheat is this complex food that we eat and we can react to any part of it. It also looks to see if we have leaky gut. It's a very good measure to see if your body's making antibodies to different components of your gut. What else? So I do like the wheat zoomer. There's several areas of usefulness. One is to test for gluten sensitivity in general. It's a very good test, much more sensitive, much more accurate. The sensitivity and specificity are at 99, 98%, which is amazing and unheard of. It's very, very accurate. And then it can also be very useful to check on a gluten-free diet. So if you've been gluten-free for a while, doing great or not doing great, you can actually use the test to look and see if you're still making antibodies to different components of wheat. And then for the person who has already gone gluten-free, but they really want to test and challenge and see if gluten is a problem, and with clients, I usually don't recommend this. If you've had any benefit from going gluten-free, I don't recommend this. But for the person who really wants to, challenge if they are celiac or gluten sensitive, you can actually go back on gluten, and it's a tiny amount for this test. So for this test, you eat a half a cracker for 2 weeks, chew it very well, and then you stop eating the gluten for 2 weeks, and then you test. Now, if you wanted to do that with a celiac test with your doctor, they have, everyone's different, but they have you eat roughly 2 slices of bread a day for 6 weeks.
Oh boy.
And so for some people, it is excruciatingly painful. They're in pain for 6 weeks. And then I wonder, how much damage have you done to your body that you might not be able to repair by eating that much gluten for that period of time. So the wheat zoomer is, really useful for kind of different stages of healing and different, different people, different areas. It's been super helpful using it in my practice.
So yeah, it can be used to not only identify celiac or gluten sensitivity, but also to be used as sort of like a check-in, right?
Yeah.
Almost like a self-test to see how well you're actually adhering and maintaining a gluten-free diet. Because of its level of accuracy and specificity, in many cases, even when you think you are strictly maintaining a gluten-free diet, it will still pick up sensitivity to things that are hiding out in anything from spices to lip balm to cosmetics, or in some cases, even foods that are labeled gluten-free, but are processed and handled in a facility that also handle. And so you're looking at like cross-contamination, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
It's an amazing.
Yeah, and lately there have been a ton of studies looking at exactly how much gluten is in our diet when we're trying to be gluten-free, and it's actually shocking. It's shocking. So, they've been kind of testing restaurants here and there, and then following celiacs around. There was a study called the brown bag study where celiacs would send in every meal, and they would test the meal for the presence of gluten, and then they were also testing the humans through urine and feces. So they were looking to see, and the rates of glutening were off the charts. And, some people had no symptoms. So it really begs the question of, is gluten sneaking into your diet, and where, and, how can we remedy that?
So it's a lot harder than we think to actually go gluten-free, right?
It is really hard. Yeah.
These micro exposures can trigger inflammatory reactions for months, right? Which
up to 6 months.
Really daunting, right? So what can we do about it? What can be done to mitigate the risks? Like, let's for a few moments about the practicalities of walk us through your daily life and how you kind of manage avoid gluten and what works for you and what maybe doesn't.
Yeah, so I'm one of those individuals that has chosen to not eat out. So I'm like the worst for this piece, but I counsel my clients all the time. So, as far as avoiding gluten, the only way you can be 100% certain is if you're cooking all your meals and you're not eating packaged food, right? That's not reasonable for most people. So most people are not going to do that, and they're going to need to eat some packaged food here and there. And you're going to need to eat out and eat at friends' houses and family, So I feel kind of lucky that I grew up with food allergies as well. So I feel like I had some tools before I got diagnosed with celiac for how to deal with all of this. But so I kind of like blend the allergy world with the celiac world. So, one big piece is to realize that the people around you have no idea. They have no idea what gluten is. They have no idea, what it does to you. And so I think the first step is to just begin having those conversations with the people in your life. Let them know why it's important to you to avoid gluten. Let them know what it is in the first place, and let them know what happens to you and the suffering that you go through if you eat it. And if you don't have suffering when you eat it, let them know why you are motivated to do this. There's a reason why you're doing this. And I think people can support you and get behind you when you explain why. So that would be kind of my first piece, is have those conversations. My next piece is to find a good book where you can educate yourself on autoimmunity in general, or celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or like the autoimmune paleo diet. I find having that information makes you feel empowered, and it helps you formulate why you're doing this as well. So you can be, really strong in your dedication to the diet. As far as socially, I have like restaurants, friends' houses, and family. So for restaurants, I think the easiest way to go about it is, do a little research online, find a restaurant that is more likely to be friendly to you and to be able to accommodate you. And then the easiest thing to do is email them and let them know exactly what you need, what you can and cannot eat, and ask them if they can accommodate you. And it's much easier to get a no on an email than to show up at a restaurant and you're starving, and you walk in and you realize that everything is fried in the same oil and you cannot eat a single thing on the menu. So, emailing first can be a great first step. And then usually if they say, yes, we're willing to accommodate you, then you can have a few conversations back and forth. Usually they can help you figure out what would be safe to eat. And then when you go into the restaurant, find that person that you've communicated with. And I like to use these chef cards. So it's like a little card that explains what you can't eat and examples of cross-contamination. So I use that chef card that can go back into the kitchen, and then, talk to the wait staff, troubleshoot with them. So a lot of eating out requires us to be the detective. So you need to think about, is my food going to touch a spatula? Is my food going to be cut with the same pizza cutter that cuts a regular pizza? Are my fries going to go into the oil where they fry the chicken nuggets? So I think sometimes we go to restaurants, we expect them to think about all those things, and they are not in your shoes. And so they might not think about all those things. So I think asking a lot of questions, asking, how do you prevent cross contact with food? And then if you get a bad feeling, don't eat there. And if they seem like they're going to accommodate, then, go for it. You and I both use the NEMA sensor. So there's a little device that you can buy, and it allows you to test your food for the presence of gluten. And it actually tests for any gluten, not 20 parts per million or below, but any gluten. So it's very sensitive. And, it's not foolproof. It needs to be used in addition to all of the diligence. But if you're going to a restaurant, you do your due diligence, you were going to eat that meal anyways, it provides you like another level of protection to make sure your food doesn't have gluten in it. Friends' houses, I like to explain in detail, dietary needs, find out what they're going to make. And then you can either offer to show up early and help them cook, which is a great way to make sure nothing, no accidents happen. Or if you feel like they've, got it pretty much handled, I always have people text me all the ingredient labels that they're going to use. And that way I can just check everything. And they're not in the store trying to read ingredient labels, which can be, it's confusing. So I kind of let them just send all the ingredient labels to me. And then teach them about cross contact. So ask them about cutting boards and wooden spoons, and make sure your food never goes in a toaster. Make sure if they're using any sort of a jar that's opened where a knife goes into it, that they get a new jar. So like mayonnaise and butter, easily a knife with gluten crumbs can be dipped into there, and that can make you sick. So, thinking of all the ways that could possibly contaminate your food, and then having those conversations, and, be gracious to your friends when they're cooking for you. And then family, family can be tough. I definitely hear horror stories where family doesn't get it, and they think you're just being, following the fad, and that you don't need to be gluten-free. So with family, again, try to educate, try to let them know why you're doing this and why it's important. And, I think some families sometimes just don't get it. And so if they're really not getting it, or you've gotten sick in the past, just bring your own food.
Yeah.
Anywhere you go, bringing your own food is always an option. Better than getting glutened. And then you get to just be there and socialize and enjoy the social aspect of being with people. Same goes with, being at restaurants and socializing. If it's a restaurant that you're just really not comfortable with, order a safe drink, hang out, and, just enjoy the socialization.
That was like a master class on how to that's amazing. Thank you so much for all that super useful and actionable information. I love that you kind of break it up into these different arenas and areas, and it gives you the sense too that you can do this in stages. It's not like you have to make all of these changes like overnight. It's just
exactly
kind of one thing at a time, and work within your own comfort zone. And I love that you incorporated having these conversations with family, because it can be training these the social aspect of it, right? Of not having that support group, right? And if you can't get it from your family, find other like-minded people that are trying to do the same thing and cook together, and that will totally strengthen your resolve to like stick with it and give it a shot. Yeah.
And I do think it's important to find your people, find someone in your life that gets it, and who you can talk to and who will support you. And it can be family, friends, it can be somebody off of a Facebook group, or somebody from like a local non-celiac gluten sensitivity group. Just find somebody who gets it, so that you don't feel quite so alone.
There are people out there, who are doing this. You're not alone. Yeah. So two additional comments to that. One, I just wanted to add in there that the NEMA has totally been a life-saving device for us. There have been a couple instances where we've gone out to restaurants, and the meal should have, by all accounts, been completely gluten-free, but wasn't, because of the reasons you mentioned. Maybe using a knife that was also cutting bread, or sharing a fryer, that sort of thing. And in those cases, we talked to the manager, ironed it out. In one instance, they actually gave it another shot, and had the cooks in the back wear gloves and additional precautions. I had one instance which produced a really pretty awesome outcome. The CEO of this restaurant ended up writing me and thanking me for bringing it to his attention. He actually bought Anima for him and his wife. And he actually said he was going to be retraining the entire staff on the importance of gluten sensitivity. So
That's awesome.
just like this one little kind of action of speaking to the, kind of speaking up, being my own advocate and speaking with patients ended up having this beneficial ripple effect, which was pretty
That's
neat.
awesome. And I think most restaurants, they want to serve you and they want to do a good job.
Yeah.
And a lot of them just don't realize, they don't realize that they can't use the same spatula for
Or
food
if
as
they
someone
have
else's food.
free, if they have gluten-free on the menu,
Yeah.
they don't really understand, like, okay, yeah, there's not gluten in the ingredients. That's like step one, but that
Right.
doesn't mean it's gluten-free, right? Especially depending on, say they're sourcing alternative like almond flour or something from a facility and there was cross-contamination. And even before their hands have touched it, there could already be
Right.
a gluten issue there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alana, what are your thoughts on gluten digesting enzymes like the endohexapeptidase? I know there's one from Designs for Health, the allergy. Do you feel like that can be an additional insurance policy against accidental exposures, provided you're still taking all those other steps?
Yeah. So as long as you're taking those other steps, I think some people use them so they can eat out and not take the steps, which I don't recommend that. But as again, it's just like another layer of insurance. I use them. We do eat at Chipotle. That's like the one place we can eat with all of our allergies and celiac. And I have them change their gloves and get me fresh lettuce, and we do the whole thing. And I always take an enzyme just in case. So I feel like when some people travel too, and so traveling can be really difficult, especially if you travel often with work or something in your life makes you travel frequently. When you do need to eat at a lot of restaurants, your chance of getting gluten goes up. So taking all of these measures, bringing your NEMA and using your enzymes can help you, from not getting sick.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I do the same thing. I use the NEMA, we do our research ahead, and I take so I feel like aiming for that triple layer of protection, even if it sounds extreme, it doesn't really require as much work as it sounds, right? And the alternative, I often say that the price of freedom is vigilance, right? And it's like just meaning that doing that little bit of work up front can save you a lot of pain and suffering from just who wants to feel terrible, right? Like we all want to feel like we're firing on all cylinders and utilizing and optimizing our full potential. So
yeah, definitely.
That's what this is all about. It's in the end, it's not about gluten or Hashimoto's or SIBO, right? It's about, feeling amazing and then doing amazing things with that newfound energy and vitality. Right? So that's something to always keep in mind too, not to get too bogged down in all of the technical details in the mechanics of things. It's okay. Like, what kind of life, do we want to live?
Yep.
It's a gift, and we, as far as I know, everything we do, we need our body for, right? So
yeah, when you've been chronically ill, you really appreciate being healthy, because when you're chronically ill, everything becomes difficult, and you struggle through your day, and you can't do anything. It's hard to work, it's hard to be a parent, it's hard to be a partner, so we need our health. It's our foundation.
That's right, y'all. Listen to Allana. She knows what she's talking about. So I just want to say thank you so much you've been more than generous with your time, and you're incredibly knowledgeable. People are going to get so much from this discussion we've had this afternoon. So I'm going to make sure to share this far and wide and have your friends and family watch it. There's obviously so much more we could talk about. I wish we had time.
We'll have to do it again.
That's right. Yeah. And for those who might be interested, tell us a little bit about your practice and where people can find you.
Yeah, so my website is called My Celiac Solution. So I work with celiacs who have been gluten-free and not feeling better. So we work on all of the factors that we talked about, the other pieces besides being gluten-free that make you sick. So we use some lab tests, and then we use nutrition as the foundation, anti-inflammatory diet, and then oftentimes we're working on some infections with herbs, lifestyle factors. We make sure you're sleeping. We make sure you're moving your body. We check in with your thoughts, your mental state. How are you doing there? And kind of bring all of those pieces together to get you back into health and back into vitality and get your life back. And then I work with, outside of celiac, I work with autoimmunity, gut issues, skin stuff, eczema, psoriasis, kind of the whole gamut. Mm-hmm.
The whole gamut of autoimmune diseases.
Exactly.
And people can work with you remotely from out of state.
Exactly. Yep. So I'm in Colorado and I do everything online. So it doesn't really matter where you live.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
And can potential clients, run this wheat zoomer test through you to identify and look for gluten issues, celiac,
Mm-hmm.
wheat sensitivity?
Yep. Even celiac genes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the cost of that test alone, which is not too bad, comparatively speaking, is worth it alone, I feel like, just for the intestinal permeability panel.
Yes.
Yeah, it's rock solid test.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for being with me this afternoon.
Thank you, Ryan. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Appreciate very much. And I'm sure some people will have some questions in the video thread. So we'll make sure that if there's anything we missed between you and I, we'll get those answered and maybe share some helpful links so that
sounds good.
People can find you, people can find some links to the studies we mentioned. And I would love to do it again sometime.
Okay, let's do it. All right.
Awesome. Well, I'll
Have
give
a
you
good one.
back. Thanks, Allana.
All right. Bye-bye.